Welcome to the Institute of Politics and our ongoing series on America in this Trump era. And this is an evening in which we're going to be talking about how one covers our new president. You know, the First Amendment is the First Amendment for a reason, and freedom of the press has always been a bedrock of our democracy. Sometimes it's harder than others for journalists to do their jobs, and it's become much more complicated in an era of digital media when the flow of information is so vast and the competition so great. They can hear me, right? Can you hear me? No. You just missed it. Can you hear me now? All right. Well, I'm not going to repeat everything I said, but it was good. Okay. But news managers, news editors in the era of digital media and vast competition in this free flow of information that we have on the internet of real news, fake news, and now in the era of Trump face some unique challenges. And so we're lucky tonight to have some of the most eminent figures in the news industry to talk about the challenges and the opportunities that we face and just how they plan to wrestle with the challenges of this new era in our politics. And to introduce our guests, I want to introduce Nora Gonzalez, who's a second-year student studying English, to tell us a little bit more about our speakers.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to tonight's panel, America in the Trump Era, covering Trump. It is an honor to introduce tonight's guests, Anne-Marie Lipinski, David Rhodes, and Jeff Zucker, who will be discussing the media's role and their own role in covering President Trump's campaign and current administration. Anne-Marie Lipinski is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University, and former editor of the Chicago Tribune. David Rhodes is the current president of CBS News. As president of CBS, Rhodes has been named to Fortune magazine's 40 Under 40 twice now, and GQ's 50 Most Powerful People in Washington. Jeff Zucker is the current president of CNN Worldwide and a 5-time Emmy Award winner. Before serving as president of CNN, Zucker was the CEO of NBC Universal, where he began as a producer for Today Show. Finally, this panel will be moderated by the IOP Visiting Fellow, Matt Bai, currently a national political columnist at Yahoo News and former chief political correspondent for New York Times Magazine. Tomorrow, Matt Bai will be hosting his own seminar at the IOP. Please help me welcome everybody to the stage.
Thank you. I think I'm up, right? All right. Thank you for coming. It's an honor to be here with the panel tonight. I want to give you a sense of how all this came to be. When Alicia first called me from the IOP and said we want to do a panel about Donald Trump and how the media's covered him, and would you moderate a panel? I said, I don't really do panels with other, I don't like reporter panels, and I don't really like, hanging out with groups of reporters and talking about what we do. And she said, no, we're talking about like executives, people who run newspapers, people who run TV networks, like people who make big decisions. I said, so let me get this straight. You concluded that I'm the only one stupid enough to come out and just like, with the paragons of my industry and just kind of blow up my relationships and ask really difficult questions. She said, yeah, pretty much. And I said, okay. So here we are. And I am going to ask some tough questions, but these are some folks I really respect, and I think we'll have some great answers for you. David, my wife works for David, so he's not going to get any tough questions. But
this is going well so far.
Everyone else is. Where do you work again? Okay. So I want to just open it up this way, and I want to Amory, I'll start with you, but I'd like to get all your thoughts on it. Where we are just today, and every day is crazy, but I mean, let's just recap this kind of week. We've had, the major newspapers of the country are calling the President of the United States a liar in headlines routinely. He's gone to the CIA to say, among other things, that journalists are among the worst people on earth. There should be a high bar for that. We have warlords, drug lords.
I think we were only among the most dishonest, not the worst.
Well, okay, fair point. And today, his senior advisor, Steve Bannon, is quoted in the New York Times as saying the media is the opposition. And he said the media has zero integrity, zero intelligence, and no hard work. The hard work part kind of hurts. I don't know about the rest. What is this the new normal? And if it is, who's in danger here, him or us?
I'm really glad you started there, because something about that, so that came to my phone as a news alert, right? A text alert from the New York Times. And I read it, and there was something about the moment and things shifted for me, and maybe it's just the fatigue of a week now of all of this, but not that we haven't always been back to work, but for me, it was a moment where I said, okay, just enough of the histrionics. And shame on us if we take this bait. That, to me, that kind of, at least in recent history, somewhat abnormal relationship between a new administration and media calls for us to behave as normal as ever, more normal than ever. And that means doubling down on the very best reporting, on accuracy, on fairness, on investigative journalism, and to calm down and to back away from that fight. The use of the war metaphor to describe what's going on between journalists and the administration, I think is unfortunate. And I read that today and I said, there is a war, but it's, we are warriors for journalism, not in a war with an administration, and that this war is on behalf of democracy, on behalf of our readers and viewers and listeners. And a switch went off for me when I read that, and it just seemed like it was time to just get back to work.
Everybody take a step back.
I think so.
That's an interesting point. David, what would you say?
I mean, look, it's management in these things, which we're management. I mean, you're kind of the police officer at the police line with the burning building telling people to remain calm. I think that is good guidance, to tell people to remain calm. There's always a tendency at the start of an administration, and this one I think in some ways is actually no different, to try to take messages directly around the press to audiences, and there's kind of a give and take that goes on. And that give and take is going on now. I read that interview, obviously with great interest, in the New York Times, a mainstream media outlet. Look, he's got a job to do, and we have a job to do. And if we focus on what our job is, we'll hopefully do good work in that area. He's got a different kind of job to do, and that's the job he was doing in the pages of the New York Times today.
Fair enough. Jeff?
What was the question? No. So look, I think first of all we should take a step back and understand the tremendous irony of the fact that Steve Bannon had to call the New York Times to say that the New York Times was ineffectual and had lost its way. And the only way that he could get that message out was to tell it to the New York Times so the New York Times could print it. Okay? That's ridiculous.
Does he want to get the message out, or does he just want to stick it? Does he want the Times to feel it?
Listen, it doesn't. By the way, it's not hurting the New York Times feeling. Okay?
No,
so,
believe me, I know.
So that. So I think that we should just recognize the irony of that entire situation. And I think we also should realize, we're 6 days in. It feels like 6 years, but we're 6 days in to a 4-year term. Now, I totally agree, because as happens in newsrooms everywhere, the New York Times story comes out today, and all the journalists are, emailing the story around and saying, oh my God, and as David said, I think the key thing that I said was, just do your job. Just do your job. Just don't take the bait. Don't worry about it. Just do your job. And I think that is the important thing here is, look, they're trying to set up this war, which is a terrible word to use. I mean, it's just, wars have consequences, are real. We shouldn't take that bait. But they're trying to set this up. And, and they're trying to set up this opposition to one another. They have their, it is incredibly inappropriate to try to delegitimize media and journalism the way they're doing it. We should recognize that, listen, this is the most contentious relationship between an administration and the media since Richard Nixon. If they want to have that kind of relationship, okay, that's certainly their prerogative, but it feels incredibly inappropriate. But we have our job to do, and we just got to do our job.
It's inappropriate, but in a sense, one of the things I've thought a lot about is we helped get it here, didn't we? I mean, he is exploiting an opening. He's basically saying nobody trusts you, and he's found a very convenient whipping boy. And we all have, I think, some responsibility, Anne-Marie, in the sense that we've squandered that trust. I mean, you look at the polls over the years. People trust the media now less than almost any institution in American life.
Well, there's Congress.
We're right there with Congress. Right. Somehow those lines have not crossed yet.
And banks. We're with the banks.
Right. Okay. Well, we're doing all right. Lawyers are ticking upward.
But can I address this for 1 second?
Please.
Absolutely.
Yes, that's what those poll numbers say. Not all the polls have turned out to be right. But having said that, look, I think part of that with the media is, in the last 25 years, the media has become so splintered, right? The banks haven't become splintered, the Congress hasn't become splintered, but the media has become splintered, and there are different places that people can get their information, and so by its nature, as a result of the different voices and different outlets that are out there, there is going to be a lessening of trust in certain institutions within the media, and I think we have to just recognize that as well. I'm not saying that the media is perfect by any stretch, that there's not always more that the media can do, but I think it's important to recognize that there's more at work within the media.
Well, there's another analogy to Congress, where people say people hate Congress, but they love their congressman.
Right.
So people generically hate the media.
But they have their favorite media organization.
But
Correct.
They are voracious consumers of media, including, I might add, the new administration, which actually, it's been 16 years since we had an administration that was, as robust a consumer of our product. So we welcome that.
So in a way, it's all a market opportunity.
But again, generic media polls badly.
Right.
And look, a lot of the calls, emails, and other feedback we get from people that's directed at the media, when you ask one follow-up question, well, what was the story that you saw that you didn't like? Usually there's sort of no answer to that. I mean, there is an anger at institutions right now. And we're an institution that's part of a broader institution, which is media. I mean, you study this in a way. That's a problem. Generic media and specific media poll differently.
Yeah, and I think David's right about it's a rejection of media or distrust that's described, but it is language you hear about American institutions writ large. There's less trust in universities. There's less trust in
Churches, baseball.
just all of it. And I think that sort of rejection of business as usual, is something that benefited the Obama campaigns, and I think benefited this campaign. And you're seeing it expressed in different ways. But I think it's a similar sense that we want out with the old and something new. But I also think, you use the word marketing opportunity. I think that this is an opportunity. I think we have a moment where all eyes are, or many eyes, more eyes than usual, I think, are on journalism. And I think that's a great thing. And, the Post and the Washington Post and the New York Times have talked very openly about this surge in post-election circulation that they've had. The New York Times is now using it as part of a circulation
and organizations
campaign.
are beefing up, who I think would have cut back had he not won that election.
I think that's absolutely true. And so it is a moment where journalism is getting a second look. And that's a moment of great opportunity. It's also a moment of some peril, right? So if you misbehave, if people give you a second look and they don't like what they see, and all you've done is reaffirm their biases about you or their distrust for you, that's a lost opportunity. But that's why I said what I did at the beginning. It's just a time for us to be ever better, ever more vigilant, and to take advantage of this chance to kind of prove yourself again.
That's a good point. Sean Spicer came out this week in his first calamitous week as press secretary. And one of the things he said, one of the few true things he said, was that he found it demoralizing, the constant drumbeat of negativity from the media. And I found it hard to have a whole lot of sympathy because of the things they've been saying about the media. But does he have a point? Are we quickly reaching a place, or have we reached it, where it is actually very hard to cover him with the objectivity that you would cover a president, where in fact he can't get the benefit of the doubt and can't get covered for what he does because of the way the relationship has evolved?
No, this is why it's so important to maintain these standards. Look, we think we put on a high-quality news product at CBS. We've had long-standing standards and practices. I think one thing we've got to totally reject, first as an institution, but then as an industry, is this idea that the rules need to change, or standards and practices need to change. Like, our standards and practices, we think that they stand for something. So, that's like our Bill of Rights. You don't get into a situation where you say, well, now we have a sort of different situation and we're going to adjust that. The Bill of Rights polls well.
This is what worries me about calling out lies so vociferously, is the idea that you might redefine your role.
Well, that's why you've got to be careful about the tone, and you've got to acknowledge that some of these criticisms are valid, and listen to those. But if people sort of lose the perspective of what we think are the timeless values of these journalism institutions, that's the biggest mistake we could make.
You agree with that, Jeff?
Yeah, totally. I think Devin's exactly right. I would just add, I worked with Tim Russert for a long time at NBC, and Tim famously said that the role of the media is accountability of government, and to hold government accountable. And I think that is our job. So the media, by its very nature, is always going to be skeptical. And that means asking questions and being skeptical of what we're told. That's good. That's fine. I think the danger is when that skepticism becomes cynicism, and I think that there's a fine line between skepticism and cynicism, and we should remain skeptical, but not cynical about what we're hearing and what we're doing. And on the other side, they won. They're the president of the United States. They should behave like that. And they should not try to delegitimize the institutions that are important to the democracy of this country and important to the world. And I think it's incumbent on both sides to behave accordingly. Be skeptical, not cynical. Don't delegitimize the institutions upon which this country is founded and is run.
But we can't control that, the latter. We can only control the former. And
I understand.
you know,
I understand that. I agree. But even if they, that's just free advice.
There is this drum, which they'll probably take. There is this.
I doubt it, but anyway.
There is this drumbeat you hear, particularly on the left. The word that's come into vogue since, and you've probably all seen it since the election, is normalize, right? Which I'm a little baffled by. You can't normalize Donald Trump. Well, I think he got normalized when we called the election for him on election night, and I don't really understand that concept. I mean, I think there's actually a danger in deciding that he is.
Of course,
that he's
he
not
is the president of the United States, so
that makes him pretty normal.
He needs to be treated accordingly, but along with that comes the right for the press to be skeptical, to ask questions, to probe, to investigate, and not take their word for everything, as we've learned this week.
Well, let me go back to the campaign for a minute and sort of how we got to this moment, because I think this is something the media needs to take stock of too, and I wrote at the time quite a bit about, in fact. But Jeff, there was a time during the early part of the primaries where Trump was routinely polling 25% of the Republican field. But if you were watching Sunday shows, if you were watching CNN, you might have had the impression he was polling 60%. He was taking about 70% of the airtime, either by showing up or by being talked about or reacted to. And maybe because we hadn't seen anything like that before, but largely I think too because it was pretty entertaining and it was pretty good business. Do you regret doing that at all? And if you had thought at the time he could win, because most of us did not, would you have done things differently?
Okay.
I don't like the way you just said okay.
No. Look, I mean, obviously you're going down a road that I've been asked a lot about, which is fine. I mean, and I get it. So I have said, you asked about Sunday shows, but I'll just take it in the general, and I can address Sunday shows as well. But, look, there's no question that in the early days, in the summer of 2015, all the cable news networks ran a lot of Donald Trump's rallies in full, unedited. That's true. All the cable news networks did that. I've acknowledged that. I've said it. The others haven't. I have. If I could do it again, that was a mistake. Okay? And I've said that. I'm the only one that said that. We all did it. Okay. Now, I do not believe that is why he was a Republican nominee. I do not believe that is why he's president of the United States. And I think to think that is giving us way too much credit. Now, look, on the flip side, you asked about Sunday shows and how he dominated the coverage. Look, from almost immediately after he announced, he was the front runner for the Republican nomination by a wide margin, almost from the start.
Well, in a field of 17 candidates.
Well, but nonetheless, he was. Number two, he continued, as he has this week, throughout those early months. He made news every time, he showed up at one of those rallies or did an interview.
He was available to be interviewed.
And by the way, our job is to cover the news, so he was newsworthy. And finally, he was available for interviews in a way that his competitors were not.
Right.
And frankly, I don't think that we should have been penalized just because Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush and Scott Walker declined to do interviews. Okay? The fact is, give the guy credit. He said yes when we asked him to come on. They didn't. That's on them. That's not on us. And just because they're all saying no doesn't mean we should say, oh, well, we're not going to do Trump because he said yes. Okay? So, I think that those candidates and campaigns should look in the mirror and look at themselves and the campaigns they ran, rather than try to blame us for putting Donald Trump on.
Well, David, let me bring you in on this.
I was good out of this.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, let me bring you on this despite
You sure you don't wanna bring
my
Jeff back?
my long-standing and deep abiding love for CBS and all that it does. Les Moonves, the chairman of your company, said during the campaign, he may be bad for America, Donald Trump, but he's damn good for CBS.
Good luck with this one, David.
Did you have a conversation with Mr. Moonves about that comment, and do you share the sentiment?
Look, no, he was taken out of context.
I do love CBS, by the way.
No, he was taken out of context. These
Oh, the
comments-
media.
No integrity, no intelligence, no hard work.
Look, first of all, we do have, while I do report to him, we do have a church and state within our company about the news operation. So that's the first thing. Second, these were comments made at an investor day hosted by a major bank on the West Coast, and they were made in the context of talking about the local television station advertising market. Now, you can't outrun something you've said, and it's been oft repeated in so many
I've done my part
since then. But the idea that he made that comment, and so then we all willfully took part in some grand conspiracy to elect Donald Trump is like ridiculous.
Completely ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't think I would take it quite that far either. Anne-Marie, one of the puzzling things to me was a sort of a drumbeat of criticism, even in the fall, even before the election actually happened, that he wasn't vetted enough. We hadn't vetted. Donald Trump, he kind of skated through, this part of the primaries we're talking about. They hadn't been vetted. I actually felt, I will tell you, I actually felt he'd been vetted more than any candidate I'd ever seen, including that famous tape that was released. But also, I felt like every misstatement, every hypocrisy, it just didn't stick with people. But I felt like it was all out there. Do you feel he was vetted adequately by the media?
So I think there was plenty of vetting. Here's what I think there wasn't plenty of, though. I don't think a lot of journalists were taking the candidacy seriously. Long past a point where that should not have been the case. And so for me, I always think back to this moment in the summer of 2015, and there was this announcement from the Huffington Post, which I want to quickly say went on to do some very good work. But you'll remember that summer that they announced
they said he was an entertainment story.
They were not going to cover Trump's candidacy in their news and political columns.
Yeah, that was absurd.
That was crazy.
I think the announcement ended by saying, if you want to read about him, you will find our coverage next to our stories about Kim Kardashian and The Bachelor. So that was, and there was a lot of applause for that, including among journalists. Mm-hmm. And I was horrified because since when do journalists get to decide for the voters who's a serious candidate or not? And at the very same time, because it was just a couple weeks later in August of that summer, so that's July, in August, Evan Osnos of The New Yorker, who learned everything he knows working in my newsroom at the Chicago Tribune, wrote this amazing piece. He'd been out all summer and had been traveling with and around Trump and talking to his supporters in 6 states in the middle of the country. And if you read that story just a handful of weeks after the HuffPo announcement, you knew this candidacy was serious as a heart attack. There was nothing, Kim Kardashian-ish in terms of it's not going to change the world about it. And I remember thinking these two things they can't coexist, right? We can't say this is not a serious candidacy while all around us, or at least all around Evan, was evidence of a very deep well of support for him. He had an amazing ear for the culture and the popular culture and what was happening in quarters where many journalists were not. And so that, to me, was that was our sin.
I'm absolutely guilty of that. Although I would add that I think, I do think that the fracture, the nature of that field, the fact that it didn't win out, the fact that Chris Christie took out Marco Rubio on a debate stage in New Hampshire when he was, ascendant. I mean, I do think that Trump was not headed like a steamroller.
Yeah, but that's not the media's fault. That's not the media's responsibility.
That's true.
So I mean, that's where I think like to self-flagellate ourselves about that is ridiculous. Okay, that's not our responsibility. Chris Christie and Marco Rubio, they should look in the mirror. That's what they did to themselves.
Oh, absolutely.
The media didn't do that.
No, I'm saying there was a reason. I think the skepticism of the media about his candidacy was well placed.
No. That was the skepticism of those other candidates. They actually never believed that he would be last man standing.
That's certainly
okay. And so that's the campaigns they ran. They were nice to him the whole step of the way because they never believed it was real. In the second debate at the Reagan Library in the presidential primary season, Jake Tapper asked two of the candidates standing on the stage if they had any problem with Donald Trump having his finger on the nuclear codes. And they both ducked the question and didn't want to answer it. That's not the media's fault. That's not our fault. That's not Jake Tapper's fault. That's their fault. Okay? Now, by the way, that's their responsibility. So, you can't blame the media and you can't blame Donald Trump. Okay?
Well, and interestingly, Hillary Clinton, I think, made the same mistake in the fall campaign of basically saying people aren't going to elect him. I don't have to.
Well, but let's say something about surprise, because that's actually something that is a little bit insidious. Is this whole narrative like, well, people weren't told to expect something, or they were surprised. Some news is surprising. Like that's why it's news. Okay, like, oh, I'm so surprised. You guys didn't tell me this was coming. We did.
Well, and the New York Times doing news. My old newspaper doing news alerts. Because the projection is now that Hillary's going to win by. When did we become soothsayers?
The problem with that is that data journalism, as it was called, is not a substitute for journalism.
Nor is it predictive.
Talking to people and finding out what's happening. We did a debate in South Carolina ahead of the South Carolina Republican primary, where Donald Trump attacked the Bush family, complained that we were misled into the war in Iraq. Lamented like the 8 years of the Bush administration.
Right.
And we thought something bad was going to happen. We thought, well, you can't say that in a South Carolina Republican primary, or we thought the audience would have a negative reaction to this. That was the last Republican president for 2 terms. That's the first family of Republican politics at that time. Well, Jeb Bush got 10% in that primary and had to drop out, and the crowd loved what he had to say. And it didn't matter that what he had to say is something that sounded like a Democratic Party talking point. So that was surprising. And it's okay that that was surprising. I don't think anybody could have predicted at the start of the Republican primary process that attacking the Bushes and, Republican foreign policy orthodoxy was a winning strategy.
No, but you raise a point that's really that I feel strongly about too, which is I don't know when we got into this mindset that our job is to be able to predict the future. It has no value for readers. It's fun, right? Like markets are fun, gambling is fun, but it can be a part of your coverage if people want to click on it. But when it became news that we can predict one way or the other, I mean, I think we deserve a little.
Well, it's become also part of the White House narrative now in an attempt to try to discredit the media that the media didn't predict that Donald Trump would win.
We walked into that.
So it plays into their narrative. But I think, as David points out, it's it's why it's called news.
Right. It's already happened.
Right. But see, I think that this is also goes back to your implicit criticism of us carrying those early rallies. Part of why we carried those early rallies is because, in New Hampshire at one of those rallies, he calls out, an entire religion, and at another interview that he's doing, he belittles Senator John McCain. Now you could say, well, you could tape them and you could, then play those comments back. But, the fact is he was the Republican frontrunner. He was making news, and that's what our job is.
Fair enough. What about the tweets, Jeff? It's interesting. You know, there's been a debate about, are we too easily manipulated by his use of Twitter? I happen to think you have to. He's the president. He's communicating.
Yeah.
If that's his form of communication, you got to cover it.
So my position on this is that, you know, we make editorial decisions every day on the president. Let's go back to President Obama. He spoke every day, one way or the other, and we would make an editorial decision as to whether or not we would, you know, give airtime to that speech or those comments. This president decides to do it through a different type of communication. And so our job is to make an editorial decision as to whether it is newsworthy or not. We should not cover, put on the air, report on everything he tweets. We should use our editorial judgment and decide whether it's newsworthy, and then analyze what he reports. And I think that it's our editorial job to cover those tweets, because when the president says something, it is by its nature news.
Right, and actually, I think, you know, using Twitter in a weird way, he's actually modernizing the presidency. I mean, whatever, you know, whether it's the radio or the TV or it's Twitter,
well, certainly it's prerogative.
A form of communication.
Sure.
Anne-Marie, to that point, if you're running a newspaper today, are you still sending your reporter to these briefings? Are you rethinking the policy of having somebody in the press room for all these briefings that, at least to this point, early, very, very early in the administration, you know, are sort of laced with misinformation and berating and tantrums? And if you're going to cover this White House differently, and I think you have to, do you start reassessing the actual physical presence inside the building?
I think absolutely. And I've been watching and talking to editors about how they're sort of, you know, reorganizing their coverage, and I think the one thing that I hear that is the most distressing is this notion of sort of doubling down on the White House, and, you know, sending more bodies to the White House. And, you know, we've seen this past week, it's sort of exhibit A of how excessive focus there. Just somebody referred to the president this week as the assignment editor-in-chief, right? For America's newsrooms, and I think there is an element of that, and it's now not just him, but my new favorite word, the surrogates, where a declaration in the briefing room now becomes, you know, it sort of dominates hours worth of news coverage. And I keep thinking about the guys like David Farenholt and others who are finding the real stories, hopefully, you know, out in the agencies, out in the country, and not just focused on the rhetoric. And I think to the extent that we are over-focused on the rhetoric, we're gonna lose. I mean, we as a democracy are gonna lose, because that's so easy to manipulate, and it's so easy to dominate, and that's one of the things that the Twitter stream does. My like personal act of protest is if you're somebody who just retweets the president, I unfollow you. Because I don't need that, right? I need context, I need to understand. I need to understand, is this true, is it not? What does it mean? How does it compare or relate to other things that have been said, or what came before? But if we're doing stenography, we're not doing our job. So the Washington Post has done some reorganization on the national staff that I think is exciting. And so the old kind of building beats, as you know, we'd call them in newsrooms, are in part going away. So you have somebody whose job now is to cover the urban-rural, you know, divide in this country. You have somebody, you know, Mary Jordan, whose job now is she's the grievance reporter. I worry about what happens to local news as newsrooms are spending an increasing amount of their budget on, you know, on the White House and on the administration, because we need to understand what's happening out in the country. We missed the story a couple of years ago, and the impact of this administration on actual people and where they live and where they work is something that I think we're at risk of missing again.
Either of you guys disagree with that?
I think you can do both, and so I would disagree to the extent that you know, we've doubled down on covering the White House because I think there is a never-ending amount of news coming out of there. But you know, I mean, we've invested heavily in our news gathering budget, and we are also covering. You know, I do think that one way to cover this administration is from outside the White House.
But you have the ability to do both.
Well, so
which
you know,
not everyone does.
and that's why I think we're uniquely positioned with respect to that. So we're doing both, and obviously we're doing it for television, we're doing it for digital. So it's you know, and it's all comes together. I think you can cover both. I think it's incredible, both inside the White House and outside. I think it's incredibly important to do both, and I think that's how you get at this administration.
I think this whole thing about where the briefings are and who's sitting in them is the silliest.
Yeah, that doesn't matter.
Agreed.
The biggest waste of time.
Agreed.
I mean, who cares? And I'm saying that we
Yeah,
have a seat in the front row,
I
but
agree
it's
too.
like, you know, look, the last time I was here at the Institute was for a panel of former press secretaries, and that was entertaining, but, you know, it doesn't really matter where these briefings
And the briefings have been pretty much theater for a while.
Yeah, but I would say that I disagree to the extent that I do think the briefings have been important this week, because I do think that they have exposed a point of view and a thinking that needs to be exposed and seen. And so I actually think that there has been value in those briefings this week because it's exposed how they think. And that is important.
So did we not know that they want to be in this war with journalism, though? I don't
That
think
they want to be in the what? I'm sorry?
in a war with journalists. I don't think that that story has advanced, and I just worry, Jeff, that their ability to keep repeating that
I think-
refrain and that we keep covering it. You know, something really big happened this week. Many big things happened, but I'd like to know more about these gag orders at all the agencies. I mean, the
again-
stories that we're going to lose now
Yeah.
because of that
But I
act.
think I mean I can only speak for ourselves. I think we can cover both things, and I think we have covered. So we've done that story, but I think it's equally important to cover the fact that if they believe that 3 to 5 million people, illegal immigrants, voted, that's an incredibly important story because that goes to the fundamental foundations of democracy in this country. And so
but-
the opportunity to talk to the person who speaks for the president, I do think that there is value in that.
Look, Monday there was a statement by the press secretary. There was a briefing. Cable, our streaming network took the whole thing, but we were the only network to not do it. ABC, NBC broke in and took the press briefing. And, you know, we didn't really have like a long, anguished, you know, journalism conversation about it. We just thought, you know, it's a statement by the press secretary. So we'll stream that for people who want to see it, and we'll put it into pieces later if he says something newsworthy. But I felt pretty strongly like, fine, if the president comes down to the briefing room, does something, we'll break in on the broadcast network. But it's a statement by the press secretary.
And so
What's
these
the
are
big
judgments
deal?
you have to make case by case.
Yeah, but I think the briefing is always at risk of being overplayed. You know, like our news organization, one thing that brought it to prominence was coverage of the Vietnam War. You know, where, you know, famously the briefings were called the 5 o'clock follies. Right now, I'm not saying that these briefings are like that, and there is some editorial value in them. But, you know, when you walk the halls at our place, like the pictures of Morley Safer and Bob Simon are not them sitting in a briefing room in Vietnam covering Vietnam. They were out covering it. So that's what we all need to be doing, is out covering that. I mean, I agree. The briefing has a place in the coverage, but this idea that it's like the central element of the coverage is absurd. You're never going to be able to cover it appropriately.
No, I think that's right.
And you guys have, you know, very large news organizations, and you may have the luxury of doing both. What I worry about is are the newsrooms where that's not true,
Newsrooms have to
and
choose.
where someone's being taken out of the state capitol, where we are really impoverished in terms of coverage in this country.
I think that's fair.
And they're
Yeah.
being sent to, you know, babysit news press conferences.
I would pull that. I
basically.
personally would pull that reporter out of the White House. I think it's better
Yes.
spent somewhere else.
I agree with that.
Let me ask you one more question. I know we're going to go to questions real soon. I want to get to audience questions. Let me ask you one last thing, which is really, you know, more about what I've been thinking about today and what really concerns me. And I don't have an answer for it, and you may not either. But effectively, what this White House has said this week, I think if you were going to boil it down, the message to me is what they're saying is it doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter if what we say is true. It doesn't matter if you fact check us. No one trusts you anyway. No one believes you anyway. Jump up and down if you want. We're gonna say whatever we want to be true because nobody trusts you.
Okay.
And let me just say, but to the extent that that's true, I worry a little bit. What if they're right?
Okay, so I don't think it's true. And here's why I don't think it's true. Readership of the New York Times, the Washington Post is through the roof. The ratings of CBS News in the morning, in the evening, are at, highs of recent years.
But you don't think Trump supporters are running out and buying New York Times subscriptions?
But let me just finish this point. CNN's ratings are up 40% over a year ago. Okay? Viewership is up 40%. CBS is way up. New York Times, Washington Post, way up. We can't control whether Trump supporters are going to come watch CNN or CBS News or read the New York Times. That's out of our control. We can only do what we can do. We can only report the news the best that we can. And the fact is, people are flocking to these institutions right now. And if others don't want to come to CBS or the New York Times, we can't control that.
Look, I think that's what we signed up for. I mean, if you're at 38, 40, 45%, another constituencies at 15%, that's who you go after. I mean, we're an easy target in that way. But that's fine. Nobody goes into this business to be liked, hopefully.
But it's not about being liked. If we test that premise, if we say we're going to fact check you and it will cost you, and it doesn't, and it turns out that people believe him more than they believe us, where does that leave the American media?
Okay, I do disagree a little bit with that. I think some of the narrative about fact checking is a little misplaced. Well, if media had done this or done that, or if people had been, I'm not convinced that many people that made a decision one way or the other in the voting booth did it because they received, a fact check of these statements. These are emotional decisions, and people make them for, their own intellectual and emotional reasons, and not because, well, I was going to vote for this person, but then I saw a fact check on the news. I decided to vote
for
for
Pinocchios. Forget about it.
It's not the way it works. There's some people here who've run campaigns that I think would probably confirm that's not the way people make these decisions. And so I think this idea that if only these statements had been fact-checked.
Well, I'm not. I think we are fact-checking. I think my concern is
you're saying
what if it has no impact? Then what does that say to the American political system?
But see, I guess what I'm saying is, if
Jeff's more optimistic.
If somebody checks it and it doesn't make an impact, it means that there was some other factor for that person that was more important than those facts. Yeah. I think that.
Well, and we saw that clearly in the exit polling. A third of the country thought he was qualified. A third thought he had the right temperament, and a whole bunch of those people voted.
It felt very strongly and voted a certain way.
They wanted change.
And I think we have to respect that.
Apparently, there's no interest here in asking questions.
Whoa!
Exactly.
We live and we work in this time where, in terms of news consumption, it's choose your own adventure. Journalism. And the Wall Street Journal has done this amazing work recently where it's looked at people's Facebook feeds and the blue-red nature of what people are choosing, opting into and choosing to read and choosing to post is we know it, but it's shocking and startling still to see. And so we are tuning out things that we find discordant with our own beliefs. And you're describing your reference to the Vietnam War is so. I have such nostalgia for a time in which in which none of us worked, but that was a time where there was we had town squares as a country, right? I used to walk into the Chicago Tribune building every day, and carved into the marble was this quote from Arthur Miller that said, "A great newspaper, I suppose, is a nation talking to itself." We're not that anymore. There's not a common town square or nations screaming at each other, using our own facts. And I think that's a dilemma in a democracy where you want a proliferation of news sources. That's a healthy thing on the one hand, but you do want a common core of conversation.
But that's not coming back.
No,
but I think we should take. I think that it does say something that readership of the New York Times and the Washington Post and viewership of CBS News and CNN is really thriving right now. That's a good signal.
Yahoo's traffic's pretty good too, just by the way.
I didn't mean to leave Yahoo out. I'm sorry.
Okay, here's the deal. So I've been told we give questions. I know everybody wants to take as many as we can. Try to keep them short. Address them to someone if you want. And I believe we reserve, how many of the first questions we reserve for students? All right, 5. So the first 5 questions, I'm going to check your ID.
Well, you've met me before, so
You
that's
better
okay.
damn well be a student. All right, you're good now. All right, go ahead.
That was actually a great segue into my question. So now you get to talk more about it. My name is Matt Enlow, and I'm a second-year student at the law school. I also want to say it's great to see Matt back. Bruce Reed brought him here last quarter. It was one of my favorite events.
I appreciate that.
Matt, you mentioned this earlier, but I want to say it again. Today, Steve Bannon was quoted in the NYT saying that the media here is the opposition party, and they don't understand this country. However, simultaneously, this administration has told lies and is working to suppress information, scientific and otherwise. You mentioned this briefly in the discussion about gag orders, and we've heard Sean Spicer carefully change his language to "the president believes" instead of just stating facts, or rather, alternative facts. How do you intend to balance holding this administration accountable with the threat of many of its supporters simply closing themselves off from streams of information they disagree with?
I think you just summarized the last half hour very succinctly.
Do our jobs.
And I wrote this beforehand too.
I think the answer is to do our jobs, not be intimidated, and to not worry about what Steve Bannon calls us. It doesn't hurt our feelings.
Well put. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Allison. I'm a student at the policy school and the business school here. My question for you is, most of your answers this evening have been assuming the folks in this room who are probably very vociferous consumers of the news. We take in information from a lot of different sources. We take in a lot of information. But most consumers of news are casual consumers of news that aren't getting all of the information, that aren't often getting many different sides of the story or even all of the different stories that are happening. So how do you think you should change potentially your coverage to make sure that the people who only get a very small amount of news are actually getting the important information and not the theater?
I mean, there's a certain amount of repetition in any coverage, and there's always complaints about that repetition, but that's the reason for it, is that actually for the casual news consumer, they're not watching in those long blocks or checking in constantly. That's the reason you see that, I think, in any coverage.
Anyone else? That's good. By the way, if you haven't seen CBSN, it's really very good.
There's some repetition.
No, but it's really very good.
I forget, where does your wife work?
Ellen's actually worked for me 3 times, which is kind of great.
3 times?
Yeah.
I keep begging her to stop. It doesn't get me anywhere. Yes.
Again, thank you so much for coming. My name is Vivian Fan. I am a second-year MBA student at the Booth School of Business. I wanted to touch on a point that Anne had made earlier about local news coverage. So one of the big side effects of the 2000s recession was that a lot of local news outlets had to shut down their operations. And as such, you even see with national news outlets that you've seen a decrease in field office operations domestically and internationally. And we've seen through this election that the true voice of the average American isn't really quite what we think it is, and rather the Atlantic evidence 2 weeks ago that the average 29-year-old is rather a blue-collared, not educated, college-educated worker. In that regard, especially towards CBS News and towards CNN, what changes are you making in terms of your field office operations strategy? And if it is not your responsibility, then whose specifically responsibility is it to voice those unheard American voices?
So I don't run a newsroom anymore, and I don't mean that I just want it to be clear that I'm not making those decisions anymore. But I have a lot of journalists in my program at Harvard who are making those decisions, and I think that so I'll talk about one innovation that I think holds promise, and that is for more networked coverage of news, which means acknowledging that no one place can do everything, and so you see organizations banding together to elevate the quality and the dissemination of regional and local news. So NPR, right, is an example of something that has a national network of 200 and some local news operations in effect, but even they are now reaching beyond that, and in local markets and also nationally thinking about who are the partners we can work with to more deeply cover the stories, to increase the number of people we're speaking to, and to enhance the reach that we have, the audience that we have. That's something that was anathema, when I was coming up. You just, like, if you worked for another news organization, you were a competitor. I mean, and you would never share information, let alone a story, and co-publish something. That's changed really radically, and I think is changing more, and I think that's an exciting and promising possibility.
I have to tell you, I don't, just speaking personally, I hear the constant assumption, the talk, and the self-flagellation in the media. We don't understand the anger. We didn't know what was happening out there. I don't really think that's true. Look, when I came to Newsweek as a national correspondent, I don't know when it was, 1997 or something, we had probably 10 domestic bureaus. And I came as a national correspondent, and I flew around the country. That's all I did, is went all over the country. I don't think we were any less understanding because we ended up closing bureaus later on. And I don't know, people talk about political reporters. I don't know anyone who travels the country more than a lot of us political reporters. And I've chronicled and written about that anger for over a decade, and so have a lot of my colleagues. I just think I did not understand, I did not think that could be exploited to that effect in the way it was in a crowded field in a Republican primary. And I think, in the general election, there was probably some dynamic of, it seemed so absurd. What he was saying seemed so patently absurd to so many people covering the news that it was hard to get around the idea, hard to see a result where that could galvanize enough of the country until very late in the campaign. But I don't think the failing was in not understanding how the anxiety of the American voter or the economic condition out in the country. I think that's been really well and deeply chronicled by all kinds of media, and I don't think there's an ignorance there.
I do think, though, that we let polling drown it out in a lot of instances.
Well, the polling thing's just out of control. And
we might have been listening, but I think a lot of journalists, checked what they might have heard in deference to what the data were saying, and that was a mistake.
And bad polling is really a pox on our industry. Bad, cheap polling is really, we need. We haven't talked about it, but I would certainly argue that we need to step back from the polling that we do and think about when it's appropriate, how you do it, and how well you do it. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Dylan. I'm a first year in the college, and I'm just wondering if you can talk about the obligation that media organizations have to strike a proper balance between covering candidates and their personalities and sort of the day-to-day drama of a campaign, and then actually the policies that they're supporting. And then in a sort of similar vein, as far as cable television goes, what is the value in having panels full of pundits going on and talking, in spite of the fact that, particularly in this election, most of them were wrong?
Yeah.
Man, I don't know who'd be the right person to take that one. Look around.
Anne-Marie, go ahead. So, listen. I'm going to turn this over to the #1 panelist on CNN, David Axelrod. So that guy was more right than anybody. Now listen, here's the thing. I actually disagree with the premise that these large panels were wrong about everything. In fact, I think, and by the way, I've heard this criticism too. In fact, look, I think that what we tried to do with having the large panels was to present multiple points of view. And you have to remember that during the primaries, there was the Clinton point of view, there was the Sanders point of view, there was the Trump point of view, and there was the non-Trump Republican establishment point of view. Okay? So within those primaries, there were 4 different points of view at play. And our feeling was it was important to represent each one of them. So right there, you're going to have 4 different points of view, and then hopefully some nonpartisan analysis. That's why we ended up with large panels, and frankly, we think that they ended up serving us well by, channeling the emotions that were out there in the public. We took a lot of criticism for hiring all these Trump voices. Okay, and I think we had 7 Trump voices on our payroll. Well, you know what? It turned out the guy won. We were right to actually acknowledge that there was this anger, this point of view, this philosophy that was out there. Perhaps we recognized that before a lot of others did, and we actually had a lot of those voices on our payroll. So that's why we thought that there was value in the Trump voices. That's why we thought there was value in the large panels, and quite frankly, we think they were very effective.
I just want to briefly get to the thing you stated too about policy versus personality, which is something I've written a book about. But no, I just want to say, what policy? I mean, understand in August, when there was not much going on and everything was Trump, I went to Hillary Clinton's campaign and I said, you have a $250 billion proposal to rebuild infrastructure that you're going to do in your first 100 days, and it's completely non-specific. I would like to sit with her, and I would like her to tell me why infrastructure and what she's going to do. There was a whole bunch of discussion, and they came back and said, no, she's not going to do that. She's not going to talk about that, right? She didn't. The idea that Hillary Clinton ran a policy-laden campaign might be the biggest lie of the entire election. If you went to the website and actually tried to read it, what you found were incredibly shallow laundry lists of everything ever proposed with no choices, no priorities, and no specifics. So they could have been written by interns. They probably were. Someone in line probably wrote them. So, I will tell you that I am not only happy to, but determined to write about the ideas that people will use to run the country if and when they get elected. But they have to have the courage and the creativity to do that. And that was not in this campaign.
And then, Matt, I would also add that, I think the implicit in your question is that there was maybe too much emphasis on personal versus policy. But if you look at what the Trump administration did here in the first 5 days of this first week, what is anybody surprised about? I mean, the fact is, this is what he talked about. This is what he said he would do. This is what was examined, ad nauseum on those large panels for the last.
You just said ad nauseum.
Well,
just because it made you nauseous doesn't mean it wasn't good.
I was trying to play into his hand for the last 6 months. Now whether there's any real meat on the bones of what they've announced this week, time will tell. We don't know that yet, right? It's unclear whether there's any reality to much of what they've signed this week. We'll know that over time. But as policies that they've done this week, this is what was talked about everywhere for the last 6-8 months.
Can I just, one small minority voice point, present company excluded, I do think that there has been an over-reliance, an increasing over-reliance on punditry over reporting. And I would just urge you all as consumers to, if a lot of people prefer that, but not everybody does, and to choose your news sources because they suit whatever your needs are. But I do think that has been that's a trend that I'm cautious about.
So I would like to just push back on that for CNN, speaking for CNN, that again, I think that what we have done is actually done both. And you can have both reporting and, punditry, as it were. And that's actually clear in the fact that we have doubled our news gathering budget for reporting. So the fact is, we have doubled down on reporting. And if you just look at the last 3 weeks, what we have done is broken news story after news story about this administration. and we can report and we can analyze at the same time. And for us, that has been the secret to, I think, our success, which is reporting and talking about it.
All right, you got a lot of answers there, man.
Wow.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Michael Siffer. I am a student. Here's my ID. In retrospect, should that initial story have been a story that Donald Trump wouldn't necessarily accept the result of the election? And if it should have been a story, do you believe you've covered everything that happened after that fairly?
Yes. I mean, he's the one who initially raised the idea that he might not accept the results of the election. So I'm not sure we were covering something that he didn't say. So he said it. As a result, it was newsworthy, and we reported it and discussed it. And in the time since the election, I think we have been vigilant about reporting on Russian interference in the election and discussing it. So I feel very comfortable with both parts of that.
All right, thanks.
I'm getting a hook sign. I think we could probably do. Let's try and do. Do we have time for 2 more questions? Okay, let's take 2 more questions, and I'm just going to apologize to everybody else in line. I feel badly.
Getting to the truth requires a certain amount of detective work and investigation to get beyond an exciting clash of perspectives. So from that point of view, looking at the historical context, we've seen before political regimes based on destabilizing any coherent truth and discrediting any independent media. Hannah Arendt writes about the Stalinist regime in these terms. So we see a lot of reports that there isn't any real evidence that Trump has a Russia connection. So I'm surprised that investigative journalists haven't taken Trump's actions now, aside from his not saying anything critical of Putin, but his very methods are following along Putin and Stalin playbook. So why isn't that, taking a historical view, a basis of connecting the dots, that Watergate ended up getting presented as a coherent story only because people stepped back from some exciting things that could be contested and really looked at how the whole thing fit together? Why don't journalists do that now?
Speaking for myself, I think there's often an assumption when I talk to readers that because they haven't read an investigative piece that they know has to be true, that nobody's bothering. And in fact, the reality, as we all know, is that investigative journalism is painstaking, long, and often you can't nail down what you want to nail down. I assure you, every major newsroom in this country is devoting resources to the connection between Donald Trump and the Russians and what exists, if anything exists. And I just think sometimes stories are easier to get, harder to prove, take longer to do. But it's certainly, the absence certainly is not evidence of a lack of commitment. I mean, David, I would presume you're not leaving that alone.
Look, that stuff takes time. 60-minute stories take a lot of time. I appreciate what you're saying about historical context, but you can't sort of start with the narrative and then back out the facts from there. It has to go the other way around. If we're able to establish something specific about this or any other administration, then we'll try to put that in some historical context, but that does come later.
If that story's there, we're going to get it. I feel pretty confident. Yeah.
Hey. So this has been a really great conversation, but my question is, to get some contrast, what were some of the challenges of covering the Obama administration?
You just got conflicts right and left at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Listen, I do think that one thing that is similar at this moment in time, maybe it sounds different or the style is certainly different, but I just believe that there is always an effort at the outset of any new administration to try to communicate directly without going through independent media, because they've won, they feel emboldened by that win, they've had an emotional and direct connection with these audiences, and so there's a discussion about how they'll be able to do it without us. And over time, eventually, you come to some kind of middle ground.
And let's also be clear. I mean, you know, the Obama administration, as a policy, you know, went after leakers and, frankly, tried to prosecute cases of leaks and journalists. And, you know, that is, you know, that is something that I think didn't sit well with many journalists and many journalistic organizations. And we shouldn't forget that, too.
Do you want a last word, Anne-Marie?
Maybe not about that, but I did want to say that I was thinking about, you know, we lost a journalist, feminist icon yesterday, Mary Tyler Moore. And there are a lot of women who got into journalism in part inspired by her. And to the previous gentleman's question, and to your excellent answer about, you know, investigative reporting as a patient science, work does take a long time. But connecting it to another feminist icon, you know, Gloria Steinem said over the weekend in the run-up to the launching the Women's March in Washington, she said, I've been thinking, you know, she's in her 80s now, and she said, I've been thinking, what's the advantage of a long life? And the advantage of a long life is, you know, that things can be worse. And I think, and that we've lived through worse. And I think journalistically, you know, this is a very frenzied week, and we're having this conversation in a moment where there's a lot of frothing about this. But I work with journalists from around the world every day, journalists who work in Turkey, and journalists who work in, people whose colleagues are killed for doing journalism by the state. And I just want to be really clear that this work is a privilege and it's a responsibility. And to the young students in the room, to any of them who are thinking that this might be a calling, I hope you're not dissuaded by anything you heard here, because this work needs you more than ever. And presidents have always hated journalists. For my sins, I've been reading Thomas Jefferson lately, and I read a letter that he wrote to about this very thing, and he proposed a 4-section newspaper, which would include sections named truth, probabilities, possibilities, and lies. And so I'm going to start a paper called The Thomas, and if any of you would like to work for that 4-section paper, I think now is the moment. But this is a very old story that we're telling, and we don't know how this one ends
So that's
yet.
a great note, but the only thing I would say is the United States is not Turkey and Russia, and we need to remember that it shouldn't behave when it comes to press.
Right.
And we shouldn't let the administration think that it is.
I agree.
Thank you.
This has been a magnificent panel. Its only deficiency is it's just too small.
Right, exactly.
There needed to be more people on this panel. Since you invoked Mary Tyler Moore, I want to say a word for Lou Grant. I want to say a word, I echo everything that you said. I cannot think of a more important time in my lifetime for journalism. I think this is not only an exciting time to be a journalist, it's an essential time to be a journalist, and it's also an essential time for people to be running news operations in this country who have level heads and lots of courage. And so we're grateful for the work that you do, and Anne-Marie, that you do in counseling journalists all over this country. And Matt Bai, I'm glad that you broke your self-imposed rule and decided to moderate. We appreciate that, and hopefully some of you will visit Matt's his seminar tomorrow, and we hope you'll be back often. So thank you very much.
My honor.